Their sword hovered inches from his neck when she walked in and took the sword with it. Part 1. Not ideal. The sword was beautiful. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the cold stone floor pressing into my knees. Not the 7 robed Verk judges staring down at me from their raised platform like I was something found on the bottom of a boot. Not the silence, which was the kind of silence that has weight and teeth. The sword. It was curved slightly, the metal a deep gray with a blue edge that caught the chamber light and held it. The blade was maybe 3 inches from my neck. I could feel the air displacement when the executioner, a Verk called Theo Von, shifted his grip. I thought, that is genuinely fine craftsmanship. This is what happens when you have been a first contact officer for 11 years and then a desk assignment for 3. Your brain stops responding to danger the way normal people's brains do. Normal people feel terror. I felt a low, flat observation that the metal quality was exceptional and that my knees were going to hurt tomorrow. If there was a tomorrow. Well, my name is Davin Marsh. I was, at the time of the sword situation, humanity's diplomatic envoy to the Verk Conclave. I want to be clear about what that title meant in practice. It meant I was the 14th name on a list. The first 13 had scheduling conflicts, better postings, more political value, or the basic instinct to say no when the assignment packet landed in their message queue. I said yes because I had nothing else going on. The Verk Conclave controls transit rights through the Thale Corridor, a stretch of navigable space that cuts 14 months off the journey between humanity's outer colonies and the supply lines they depend on. 14 months. That is not a number. That is medicine expiring. That is food shortages. That is the slow arithmetic of people dying from things that were preventable if the ship had arrived on time. So humanity needed the corridor. And the Verk, who had controlled it for 800 years before we even developed radio, were not in the habit of sharing. My job was to open a conversation, not negotiate, not resolve, just crack the door. I cracked it into my own face. Here is what happened. Humanity's colonial survey drones, 3 months before my arrival, had crossed the Thale boundary. The boundary is an invisible demarcation line with the legal and spiritual weight of a blood oath in Verk culture. We did not cross it out of aggression. We crossed it because the navigation software on the survey drones used a star chart that was 4 years old. And in 4 years, the Verk had redrawn the boundary by approximately 12,000 kilometers due to a territorial compact with a neighboring system. Nobody told us. To be fair, they did not know they needed to tell us. In Verk law, boundary changes are announced by ritual proclamation in the conclave chamber and then considered universally known. The proclamation had been made. It was therefore known. That we were not present and did not receive the announcement was, in their legal framework, irrelevant. The drones crossed the line. The conclave issued a formal grievance. I was sent to apologize. I apologized. The problem was tense. Verk High Formal, the dialect used in legal proceedings, has a grammatical distinction that does not exist in any human language. There is a past completion form, which means the violation occurred and has fully ended, and a present continuance form, which means the violation is ongoing. A proper apology requires the past completion form. It signals that the offense is finished, acknowledged, and sealed. I used the present continuance form. My translator had given me the wrong conjugation. I did not know enough Verk grammar to catch it. What I said, in front of the full conclave in their most formal dialect, was the rough equivalent of, "We are violating your boundary, we acknowledge this, and we intend to keep doing it." There was a pause after I spoke. The kind of pause that happens when something terrible has just occurred, and everyone in the room is waiting to see if the terrible thing knows what it just did. It did not. I smiled. I nodded. I clasped my hands in what I had been told was a respectful human gesture. 3 minutes later, I was on my knees with a sword at my neck. The thing is, they were not wrong. By their legal code, a representative who stands before the conclave and declares ongoing hostile intent, even through ignorance, even through translator error, has committed an executable offense. The law is the law because it has always been the law. Thale Vaughn, standing behind me with that beautiful gray blade, was not a villain. He was a functionary. He had a job. I had created the conditions for his job. He was doing it. I found myself cataloging his posture. He was 8 feet tall, which is average for Verk. His ceremonial robes were deep red, formal, the embroidery along the collar indicating his house and rank. He had been still for 4 minutes. He was not entirely still. The blade trembled, barely, maybe 2 millimeters of movement. If I had not been staring directly at the point of it from a very close and personal distance, I would not have noticed. Thale Vaughn was nervous. Not afraid of me. I was not frightening. I was a mid-40s human with bad posture and a translator who had ruined my career in a single conjugation error. He was nervous about something else, something coming. I started to think about what that something might be. The 7 judges conferred in low tones. The formal record keeper stood at the side wall, stylus ready. 2 ceremonial guards flanked the door, their attention directed outward, which struck me as odd. In every official description of Verk execution proceedings I had read during my transit, the ceremonial guards always faced inward. Protocol, tradition. The execution was the event. You watched the event. These 2 were watching the door. I filed that observation in the part of my brain that had been filing observations for 14 years, without ever quite doing anything useful with them. The lead judge, a Verk called Meandrow, raised one hand. The gesture meant the conference was concluded and the proceeding would continue. Thale Vaughn adjusted his grip on the sword. I thought about the Keyleth incident. I thought about the desk. I thought about the 14 months those supply ships saved by using the corridor, and whether any of that mattered now, and decided it did not, and then decided it did, and then decided I did not have time to finish that thought. I was right. The door opened. Not the main doors. The side entrance, the one used by conclave administrative staff, the one that was supposed to require 3 separate access authorizations to open from the outside during a formal proceeding. It opened. The sound that came first was not footsteps. It was the draw of a blade. Clear, clean, deliberate. The sound of someone unsheathing a weapon they had carried for a long time and knew exactly how to use. I did not turn around. I was not physically in a position to turn around. But I felt the room change. The 7 judges went rigid. Meandrow's raised hand stopped moving. The record keeper dropped the stylus. Thale Vaughn behind me exhaled once. The footsteps came then, even, unhurried, each step placed like a period at the end of a sentence. They stopped directly beside me. I looked at the boots. Regulation military issue. Left boot scuffed along the outer edge, a mark shaped vaguely like the southern coastline of a continent. The right boot was perfect. That was all I had time to see before the sword left my neck. Not pulled away, not lowered, taken. One hand came down and removed it from Thale Vaughn's grip with the calm certainty of someone picking up an object that belonged to them. The chamber went so quiet I could hear the torch flames moving. Then a voice spoke. Not loud. It did not need to be loud. It was the kind of voice that understood that volume is for people who are not sure they will be listened to. It spoke in Verk high formal. And every judge on that platform leaned forward. Part 2, she took the sword. I did not understand most of what she said. That is the honest answer. My Verk was functional, conversational, enough to order a meal in a transit station or ask directions in a docking port. Verk High Formal was a different structure entirely. It was the dialect of founding charters and treaty law, a form so archaic that most Verk citizens could not speak it fluently. It had not been spoken by a non-Verk in 3 centuries. She spoke it without hesitation. I stayed on my knees because no one had told me to move, and the situation still had approximately 9 different ways to go badly. And I was not going to add my knees standing up as a contributing factor to any of them. Instead, I looked at what I could see, which was the side of her right boot, the edge of a military jacket, and the blade she was now holding loosely at her side. The blade that had been at my neck 30 seconds ago. She was still holding it, not raising it, not threatening anyone with it, just holding it the way you hold something you have taken and intend to keep, which is a specific kind of hold that communicates ownership through relaxation rather than force. Theovan had not moved. That was the thing that told me the most. An 8-foot Verk ceremonial executioner, a being who represented the legal and martial tradition of one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the known corridor systems, had just had his weapon removed from his hands by a human woman who walked in through the administrative side door. He had not moved. He was not reaching for a secondary weapon. He was not calling out to the guards. He was standing with his hands in the position they had been in when the sword left them, and he was watching the platform with an expression I could not read from my angle. Above us, on the raised platform, the 7 judges were having a very quiet and extremely urgent conversation. Meandral, the lead judge, had his hands flat on the table in front of him. This, I happen to know from my pre-posting briefing materials, was a Verk gesture indicating that a proceeding had entered uncharted procedural territory, and the presiding official was buying time. It was the equivalent of a human judge saying nothing while they searched urgently through every law they had ever memorized. I focused on the scuff mark on her left boot. It was the shape of Australia, specifically the eastern coastline from around Brisbane down through Sydney and bending into the Bass Strait. I had looked at enough maps and enough waiting rooms to know. I catalogued this for longer than was strictly rational. Maybe 6 seconds, maybe 8. The boot did not move. She was perfectly still while she spoke, which is harder than it sounds when you are standing in a foreign judicial chamber holding someone else's ceremonial blade and addressing 7 judges in a dead dialect. She finished a section of what she was saying and Meandral made a short, sharp gesture with 2 fingers. Interruption acknowledged. A question coming. He spoke. I caught maybe a third of it. Something about standing and standing permission, and a formal designation I did not recognize, 2 words pressed together, male Thavar. She answered 3 sentences, clean and level. The judge to Meandral's left put his stylus down, slowly, the way you put something down when your hands need to be empty to process information. I wanted very much to know what she had just said. I would find out later in pieces, the way you find out things that happened while you were present but not fully informed. Here is what she said, assembled from the official record and from her own account, which she gave to me once, in a transit lounge, in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. She had invoked the Theovan exception. The Theovan exception is a clause in the Verk Conclave's founding charter, one of the original 22 articles written at the formation of the conclave 800 years ago. It is not a commonly known clause. It is not discussed in diplomatic briefings. It does not appear in any of the standard reference materials given to first contact officers or their translation teams. It appears on page 4812 of the original founding charter, in a subsection dealing with the rights and obligations of the executioner's house during formal proceedings. The clause states, in the formal legal language of 8 centuries ago, something that translates approximately as follows. If an execution is carried out against a party who arrived under the banner of male Thavar, which means guest, who comes without weapons and honest intent, then the blood debt of that execution falls not on the conclave as a body, but on the house of the executioner who carried the sentence out. Not the judge who ordered it. the executioner who performed it. I was an invited, diplomatic representative. I had arrived without weapons. I had arrived in honest intent, badly conjugated but honest. I was under the charter male Thavar. Thale Von knew this. He had known it before I knelt down. Someone had handed him this execution order fully aware of what the charter said, which meant that someone had deliberately put Thale Von's house, his bloodline, his children standing in Verk society on the sword. Not to execute me. To use me to damage him. The trembling of the blade made sense now. The guards watching the door made sense now. The nervousness of an 8-foot ceremonial executioner who had never, in his career, had reason to be nervous made complete and terrible sense. He had been handed a trap, dressed as a routine order. She had walked in before the trap closed. Mean Drow spoke again, longer this time. I caught the word for precedent and the word for charter and a phrase that I was almost certain meant this has not occurred before. She responded. I caught one phrase clearly because she said it in a slower register, deliberate, making sure the record-keeper's stylus was moving. She said the Verk equivalent of, the charter does not require it to have occurred before. It requires it to be true. Silence. Then the judge to Mean Drow's right said something, a single word. I did not catch it. The judge to Mean Drow's left repeated it. Then all 7 of them said it, one after another in sequence left to right. I learned later it was the Verk legal affirmation, the preceding equivalent of the record shows. It means, we have heard this, it is entered, it cannot be unheard. Mean Drow lowered his hands from the table. She turned slightly, and I saw her face for the first time. Here is what I can tell you about her face. It was the kind of face that people with sharp eyes and not enough caution do something they regret because of. I am not going to say she was beautiful because that word is cheap and approximate, and she was neither. What she was precise. Everything arranged with the efficiency of someone who had decided, at some point, that the world did not get to distract her and had organized her features accordingly. She looked at me. Not the way you look at someone you have just saved. Not with warmth or relief or the satisfaction of a plan working. She looked at me the way a surgeon looks at a patient on the table, taking in information, assessing status, moving on. She said, in plain standard, the first words she had spoken in a language I fully understood since she walked through that door. You can stand up now. I stood. My knees were wrong. 3 hours on stone will do that. I came up and my left knee buckled slightly, and I put my weight on my right and managed not to go back down, which I considered a significant personal victory given the circumstances. She had already turned back to the platform. She was speaking again, high formal, and now she was pulling documentation from inside her jacket. Physical documents, printed on heavy material, the kind that required a formal certification stamp to be valid in Verk legal proceedings. She had the stamps. She placed the documents on the edge of the platform, 2 arms lengths below where Mean Drow sat, the correct position for submitted evidence in a Verk hearing. She had stamps. She had formal documentation. She had shown up through a side door with a sword she took from an executioner, and the correct stamps. I stood behind her and tried to make my knees work properly, and watched the judges receive the documents, and began to understand that this had not been a rescue. This had been a plan. I was part of it. I had not known I was part of it. There is a specific feeling that comes from realizing you have been a deliberate piece in someone else's strategy, and the feeling is complicated because on one side of it is the reasonable irritation of not being informed, and on the other side is the fact that the strategy worked and you are alive because of it, and those 2 things are difficult to hold at the same time. She reached back with her right hand without looking at me. Not to check if I was there. She knew I was there. She reached back to steady me because my weight had shifted and she had noticed, and her hand closed around my forearm for 3 seconds before releasing. 3 seconds. I was thrown back 8 years. I did not show it. I had a great deal of practice not showing things. I straightened. I put my weight evenly on both feet. I focused on the platform. One of the judges was reading the documents. His face had gone very still in the way that mean drowls had. The uncharted territory stillness, but with a different quality underneath it. I looked at the judge who had gone most still and identified him by the house emblem on his collar. Then I looked at Theo Vaughn. Theo Vaughn was looking at the same judge. There it is. Part 3. What humans do with impossible situations. The judge's name was Kervas. I know that now. At the time I only knew the house emblem, a triple-line mark indicating one of the 6 founding Werk houses, the ones with enough political weight to issue execution orders that bypass the standard 3-review process. Most executions go through 3 reviews. Mine had gone through 1. The only house with both the authority to skip reviews and a strategic reason to want Theo Vaughn's house disgraced was Kervas's house. She had known that before she walked through the door. She was still talking. The documentation she had submitted was spreading across the platform table as the judges passed pages between them. Occasionally, one would stop at a particular page and ask a question, and she would answer without pausing to find the words, without checking notes, without the half-second delay that even fluent speakers show when navigating a foreign legal dialect. She had the whole 40,000 pages in her head. I will explain that number. The Werk Conclave's founding documents, treaty amendments, House Compact records, and procedural annexes total 40,219 pages in their original form. There is a compressed diplomatic summary, about 300 pages, that is given to incoming first contact officers and their teams. I had read the 300-page summary twice. I had found it moderately interesting and largely procedural, and had made notes in the margins about the sections relevant to boundary disputes. She had not read the summary. I learned this later from her, in the same transit lounge conversation, the same grocery list tone. She had requested the full archive access through the Werk Cultural Liaison Office on the grounds that she was conducting academic research into early interstellar treaty language. The Werk had approved it as a courtesy. Academic requests were always approved. It was considered a compliment to their civilization's depth of recorded history. She had spent 8 months reading the original documents. Not a summary, not excerpts, all of it. 40,000 pages in an archaic dialect that required a specialist lexicon to parse, in an archive facility that had a 4-hour daily access limit, which meant she had spent roughly 500 hours in a Werk archive reading room over the course of 8 months. For a posting she had not been assigned to yet when she started. For a diplomatic situation that had not yet become a crisis when she started. She had started before the survey drones crossed the boundary, before my posting was even announced. She had looked at the Thale corridor situation, seen what was building, and started reading. I did not know any of this while I stood behind her. I was still assembling the visible evidence. But I was good at assembling visible evidence when I was paying attention, and I was paying attention in the way you pay attention when everything in the room is telling you something important. Kervas, on the platform, had not turned a single page of the documents. He was sitting with his hands folded in a way that was designed to look composed, and was not. The other 6 judges were reading. She submitted a second set of documents. These were thinner, maybe 12 pages. She addressed the platform specifically about these, and I caught enough of the high formal to understand she was identifying a procedural violation in how my execution order had been processed, not the execution itself, the paperwork. A 3-review process requires 3 separate sign-offs from 3 separate officiating members. My order had 1. The justification entered for bypassing review was an emergency protocol, which exists for situations where a hostile party presents an immediate physical threat to conclave members. I had presented zero physical threat. I had been on my knees for 3 hours. I had a translator device that was malfunctioning and a diplomatic packet that was technically a formal apology, even if the conjugation was catastrophically wrong. The emergency protocol had been falsely invoked. This was the second charge she was laying. Not just that the execution would have violated the male Thavar clause, but that the order itself had been obtained through false procedural grounds. Kervas unfolded his hands and refolded them differently. Mean Drow looked at him. Not the way judges look at colleagues, the way someone looks at a person they are reconsidering. She paused, a clean break in the argument. Let the silence sit for 4 seconds, which is a long time in a formal Verk proceeding. Then she moved to the third point, and this one I followed almost fully because she slowed the cadence, making it land. She had found a trade clause. In the original founding documents, in a section that dealt with resource compacts between the Conclave and outside systems, there was a clause from the earliest first contact era between Verk and humanity. The clause had been drafted at a time when the translation tools were primitive, and the Verk diplomatic language had not yet been fully mapped. It granted humanity, in the language of the original text, honorary mineral access rights to a moon called Tethvor. Tethvor is a moon the Verk consider sacred ground, not for mining, for ritual. The translation error that created the clause was simple. The Verk word for ceremonial and the Verk word for geological shared the same root prefix. The human translator, working with an incomplete lexicon, had mapped the wrong definition. What the clause was supposed to say, what the Verk delegation had intended it to say, was that humanity was granted ceremonial recognition rights on Tethvor, a courtesy acknowledgement of peaceful contact. What it actually said, in the filed and ratified and legally binding treaty document, was that humanity held mineral access rights. For 300 years, nobody had looked at the original clause closely enough to catch it. It had never been invoked because we did not know it existed, because the summary documents did not include it. She had found it on page 31,406. She was not invoking it as a threat. She was not saying humanity would mine a sacred moon. She was using it to demonstrate a core argument, which was that the Verk Conclave's own founding documents contained an error that could, if weaponized, create a crisis orders of magnitude larger than one misconjugated apology. And the only reason it had not been weaponized was because the human side of the treaty had never noticed it. She was offering to formally waive the clause, permanently, in exchange for a renegotiated boundary amendment that acknowledged survey navigation error as distinct from hostile intent and established a mutual notification protocol for future boundary changes. She was giving them back a problem they did not know they had, in exchange for a problem they did not need to have. The platform went into full conference, all 7 judges leaning together, voices below the threshold I could parse. It lasted 6 minutes, I counted. During those 6 minutes, I looked at Theo Vaughn. He was watching the platform. His arms were at his sides. The execution posture was gone, replaced by something that was harder to read, a stillness that was not tension and not relief but something between them, the stillness of a person waiting to find out if they are going to be all right. I thought about what she had said, what the clause meant for him specifically. His house had been placed on the sword of a male Thavar execution. If the execution had gone through, his house would have carried the blood debt. Not criminal consequences, not imprisonment, but a formal stain on the house record, the kind that affects marriage compacts and trade agreements and the standing of your children in Verk society for 2 generations. He had been set up, not for anything he did, for what he represented, for who his house's standing might threaten in the next conclave election cycle. She had read that too, somewhere in the 40,000 pages. The House Compact records, the political architecture of who had reason to weaken whom. The conference on the platform ended. Meandral straightened and spoke. I caught it fully, both because he was speaking in a slower, formal register and because I was focused completely. He said the execution order was formally voided on procedural grounds. He said the false invocation of emergency protocol was entered into the record as a formal censure against the member who had signed the order. He said the male Thavar status of the human diplomatic representative was officially confirmed and entered into the charter record as binding precedent for future proceedings. Then he looked at her and asked a question. She answered. He nodded once, extended a specific gesture, both hands open and turned upward, which I recognized from the briefing materials as the Verk formal acknowledgement of an equal party. He had not done that when I walked in. She turned to me. For the second time she looked at me directly, the assessment look, and then under it something else, something she was not going to say. She said, "We need to sign the amendment before the session formally closes." I said, "What amendment?" She looked at me the way people look at someone who slept through the important part of a meeting. "The Boundary Navigation Protocol," she said. "I drafted it 3 weeks ago. It is page 4 of the secondary documents. You need to sign it as the designated diplomatic representative." "I have a pen," I said. She stared at me for 1 full second. "Good," she said, and turned back to the platform. I signed 4 documents in the next 12 minutes. Each one she placed in front of me at the correct moment without looking at me, and I signed, and she retrieved them and submitted them to the platform record keeper. The record keeper's stylus did not stop moving for the full 12 minutes. When it was done, Meandral struck the table once with a flat stone implement that served the function of a gavel. The proceeding was closed. I stood in a Verk judicial chamber that had been planning to execute me 40 minutes ago, holding a pen that had just signed a treaty amendment that established new navigation protocols for every colonial survey operation in the Thale Corridor region. She was already gathering the remaining documents from the platform edge. I had one thought, clear and simple and completely useless. I thought she did not know she was going to need that pen. Then I thought, yes, she did. She probably thought of it 3 weeks ago. There it is. Part 4, the thing she did not account for. We were halfway to the chamber exit when Thaelvan spoke. Not to the platform, not to the remaining conclave members who were still in quiet conference. To her. He said one sentence in Verk standard, not the high formal, and the difference in register was its own kind of statement. The high formal was the language of the proceeding. This was something else. This was personal. She stopped walking. I stopped because she stopped. She turned to face him. He was looking at her with the expression I had been trying to read since she walked in, and now that I was seeing it from the front, I recognized it. It was not gratitude, though there was something in it that was adjacent to gratitude. It was the expression of a being who had been carrying something very heavy and had just been told they could set it down. He repeated the sentence, and this time I caught most of it. He was requesting a Thaelvan. The phrase is the same as his name. I found out later that his name and the cultural institution share a root word, the Verk concept of standing witness, which means a person who watches your actions and speaks truthfully about them. Verk executioner houses traditionally take names derived from legal and observational concepts. His family had held this role for 4 generations. A Thaelvan witness is a specific formal arrangement in Verk culture. If your house is used as an instrument of harm against another party, and that harm is prevented, you carry a debt of obligation to the party who was harmed, not a debt of service, not monetary compensation, a debt of witness. You or a member of your house formally binds to the injured party for a period determined by the original harm, and during that period your sole obligation is to observe and speak truthfully about that person's deeds. It is not considered a burden in Werk culture. It is considered an honor. A witness's word is worth more than a contract because a witness has no stake in the outcome. They do not benefit from lying. Their only function is to see clearly and report honestly. He was asking to be her witness. She did not answer immediately. The silence lasted long enough that I noticed it, which meant it lasted long enough that everyone in the chamber noticed it. Sable, which I knew her name was by then because I had read her name on the treaty documents I signed, was standing still. And Sable standing still in a room full of Werk and diplomatic paperwork, and the aftermath of avoided execution, was a different quality of still than her usual operational efficiency. She did not know what to do. I understood that in the same moment she understood it, which meant I understood it slightly before her because I was watching her, and she was watching the middle distance. The refusal of a Theo von witness is an insult in Werk culture, not a mild social offense. A formal insult, the kind that enters the house record of the person who refused and sits there for 2 generations, alongside the blood debt that the witness offer was trying to resolve. You do not refuse. You accept or you negotiate the terms. But no human had ever accepted one. There was no precedent, no protocol, no section in any diplomatic briefing, summary, or full archive that covered what happened when a human accepted a Werk witness obligation. She had walked into this chamber with 40,000 pages in her head, and a plan that covered every contingency she could identify, and Theo von had just handed her a situation she had not prepared for. I could see it, the slight change in her posture, the way the document she was still holding shifted in her grip. She turned her head and looked at me. Not the assessment look, not the status check. She looked at me the way a person looks at someone standing next to them when they have reached the edge of their map. I could have stayed quiet. Staying quiet has historically been the safe option for me. I am a person who files observations in the useful someday compartment and rarely opens the compartment at a time when it matters. I opened it. I did not think carefully about whether to speak. I just spoke. Say yes, I said, quiet, not performing for the room, just to her. His word is worth more than the treaty. She looked at me for a full 3 seconds. I watched her recalibrate. There is no other word for it. She was a person who computed quickly and adjusted faster, and she took the information I had just given her and ran it through whatever process she used to make decisions and came out the other side of 3 seconds with her answer ready. She turned back to Theo von. She spoke in Werk standard, not high formal, standard, matching his register, which was itself a thing I had never thought to do in any negotiation I had conducted in 11 years of first contact work. She accepted. Theo von brought both hands to the center of his chest, right over left, fingers spread. I did not know that gesture from the briefing materials. I had not seen it in any documentation. I looked it up afterward. It is a gesture reserved for the founding of a house compact, the formal initiation of a deep obligation. It is not used lightly. It had not been used in a non-Werk context in the recorded history of the conclave. He used it. The record-keeper's stylus was moving again. Mean Drow, still at the platform, said something brief to the other judges. One of them nodded. The moment was being entered into the formal record not as a footnote but as a primary notation, which meant it would appear in the indexed summary documents and not only in the full archive. She had just created a precedent that would appear on page, one of the next generation of diplomatic briefings, for any human envoy posted to Werk space. We left the chamber with Theo von 1 step behind and to the left, which is the witness position, and which he took without instruction or ceremony, the way someone takes a position they have been born knowing. The corridor outside was empty, pale stone, long. The light here was different from the chamber, cooler, and I felt my legs inform me that the 3 hours on the floor had been an experience they would prefer not to repeat. We walked for 20 seconds in silence. Then she said, without turning, without changing the pace of her steps, "How did you know that?" I said, "I read the same 40,000 pages." She turned her head slightly, not fully, enough to catch my reflection in the polished corridor wall. "You read the full archive," she said. "I had a long transit," I said, "and insomnia, and a translator that was already failing, which made me nervous about relying on secondary sources." She was quiet for 4 steps. "You read them, and still conjugated the apology in present continuance." She said. "I missed the conjugation section," I said. "It is on page 38,000. I ran out of transit time around page 36. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. I cannot fully describe it. It was not comfortable silence, and it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had just discovered they had been in the same library for 8 months and never run into each other, and were now figuring out what that meant. She said, "Next time read to the end." I said, "There will be a next time." She did not answer. Theo Vaughn, 1 step behind us, said nothing. That was his job. We reached the transit corridor, and she held out her hand, palm up, without breaking stride. I placed my pen in it. She pocketed it. I noticed that she did not say thank you for the pen, or thank you for the words that turned a potential diplomatic disaster into a founding precedent, or thank you for standing up without falling down when you clearly needed a moment. None of those things. She just took the pen and kept walking. I found I did not mind. The thing about being the 14th name on a list is that you develop a specific skill for finding value in what is actually present rather than what you expected. What was present was a signed treaty amendment, a voided execution order, a Werk witness obligation that had never existed before, and a pen that had changed hands in a way that felt like punctuation. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. We had 12 hours until our transit departed. I had a debrief report to write that would be read by 12 people, none of whom had been willing to take this posting, and all of whom were going to have a great deal to say about how it had resolved. Behind us, in the chamber, Kervas was having a different kind of meeting. I did not think about him. I thought about the scuff on her left boot. I thought about 8 years. I kept walking. Part 5, what the sword was actually for. The sword arrived on a Thursday. No prior notification. No formal delivery record in the diplomatic messaging system. Just a courier package on my desk when I came in, wrapped in Werk ceremonial cloth, deep red, with a seal pressed into the fabric that I recognized as the Theo Von housemark. I sat down. I looked at it for a while. I did not open it immediately. Outside the office window, the station's transit ring was moving, slow and steady, the way it always moved. Ships coming in. Ships going out. 14 months saved for every vessel that used the corridor now, under the amended navigation protocols that had been filed, ratified, and distributed to every colonial survey operation in the region 3 weeks after the conclave proceeding. 3 weeks. That was how fast the Werk administrative process had moved, which, for a civilization that had been conducting business the same way for 800 years, was essentially instantaneous. The amendment had a priority notation attached to it in the filing index. First of its kind, the notation said, "Mutual protocol established by recognition of navigational error as distinct from hostile intent." It had Sable's name on the drafting record, mine on the signatory line. In the citation footnotes, there was a third name, Theo Von, as standing witness to the accuracy of the preceding record. I opened the package. The sword was inside, wrapped in a second layer of ceremonial cloth, this one a lighter color, the Werk pale gray that indicates a resolved matter, not forgotten, Not buried, resolved. There is a distinction in their culture between those things, and they mark it in the color of the cloth. I lifted it out, held it by the handle. It was lighter than I expected. The blade caught the office light the same way it had caught the chamber torchlight, that deep gray with the blue edge, the quality of the metal absolutely consistent with what I had observed from a very close and personal distance. There was a note with it, formal Werk script, 3 sentences. I did not need the translator for it. 8 months of reading had done something to my ability to parse written Werk, something that the pre-posting language training had never managed. The brain, it turns out, learns faster when there is a sword involved. The note said, translated as precisely as I could manage, the blade that was turned from its purpose returns to the one it was meant to protect. In our house records, your name sits beside Sable Oren's. This is not a gift. This is a returning. I read it twice. I set the sword on my desk flat, the way you set something down that you are not sure yet where it belongs. Then I wrote my debrief report. The report was 11 pages. I wrote it in one sitting, which was unusual for me. I am not a fast writer by nature. I am a thorough one, which usually makes me slow, but that morning the pages came without the usual stops and reconsiderations. There was something clarifying about having been almost executed. It removed the hesitation from the sentence construction. The report covered the procedural failure of the survey drone navigation system and my recommendation for a new cross-referencing protocol using current Werk boundary charts. It covered the conjugation error and my recommendation that all diplomatic translation equipment be independently verified against primary language sources before any formal proceeding. It covered the procedural manipulation by Kerr Voss and the formal censure that had been entered against him in the conclave record, with a note that the political implications for his house's standing in the next election cycle were significant and likely to reshape the internal conclave dynamic in ways favorable to the existing boundary amendment's survival. Then I wrote a section I had not planned. I wrote about Theovan, not as a procedural element, not as a functionary or an instrument of the events. I wrote about the trembling blade and what it meant, the nervousness of a being who had been handed an order that would destroy his family's standing and had no legal means to refuse it. I wrote about the house compact gesture he made when the obligation was accepted, and the way he had taken the witness position without instruction, with the ease of someone returning to something known. I wrote, he was not the danger in that chamber. He was the indicator of where the real danger was located. The executioner is never the person you should be watching. Then I stopped. I read that last line back. I thought about the Keyleth incident, about the desk, about the 3 years of processed reports and pre-screening memos and twice-translated briefings that had landed on my desk while other people did the actual work. I thought about walking into a room and being the indicator. I deleted the last line and replaced it with, "This observation is noted for future reference in Threat Assessment Protocol." Formal, dry, correct. I submitted the report. It was read by 12 people. I know this because the reading confirmations came back over the following 10 days, 1 or 2 at a time. 3 of the 12 added marginal comments. None of the comments were about Theovan. 2 were about the navigation protocol. 1 was about the conjugation error and whether the translation department needed additional funding. Nobody asked about the sword. Sable's transfer came through the following month. I heard it from Owen Grady, who ran the communications desk on the 7th floor and had a talent for learning things before they were officially announced. He told me over a meal in the station canteen, in the tone of someone delivering mildly interesting news, that Commander Oren had been posted to the Drevith system, 3 systems out past the corridor, a deep posting, the kind that took 2 years minimum and often extended. She had requested it. I sat with my meal and thought about that. She had spent 8 months preparing for a crisis that was not yet happening. She had walked through a side door into an execution chamber with a sword and a set of formally stamped documents and 40,000 pages of archive material organized in her head like a reference library. She had created a legal precedent, resolved a political trap, established a first-of-its-kind cultural obligation, and signed a treaty amendment, all in approximately 40 minutes. Then she had requested a deep posting 3 systems away. I thought about asking why. I thought about it seriously, the way you think seriously about something you are fully capable of doing but are not sure you should. I could have sent a message. It was not prohibited. We had signed documents together. There was a professional basis for communication. I did not send a message. I hung the sword on the wall above my desk that afternoon. Using a simple bracket I picked up from the station maintenance supply room. It sat flush against the wall, horizontal, the blade facing left. In the morning, when the light came through the office window at the right angle, the blue edge of the metal caught it and held it the same way it had in the chamber. The first debrief officer who came through my office after the sword went up was a young woman named Clara Booth, newly assigned, working her first independent posting review. She sat across from me with her notes and her questions, and halfway through the debrief she stopped and looked at the wall. "What is that?" she said. "A Verk ceremonial blade," I said. "Is it from the conclave proceeding?" she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me with the expression of someone who has done their reading and wants to confirm understanding. "Is it a trophy?" she said. "No," I said. "Then what is it?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about 40,000 pages read in a 4-hour daily window over 8 months. I thought about the scuff on a left boot shaped like a continent. I thought about a hand on my forearm for 3 seconds that threw me back 8 years. I thought about the one sentence she had spoken that was funny, 5 words, in a corridor outside a chamber where someone had just tried to have me executed, and how I had thought about those 5 words approximately once a day since she said them. I thought about a sword that had trembled because the person holding it knew what he had been handed. I thought about Thale Vaughn, somewhere in the Verk system, whose job now was to observe and speak truthfully, and who I was fairly certain was going to have interesting things to observe. I thought about page 38,000 and the conjugation section I had not reached. I said, "It is a reminder." Clara wrote that down. She wrote everything down. It was a good quality in a debrief officer. "A reminder of what?" she asked. I looked at the blade, at the blue edge catching the morning light. 8 months, I said. Someone spent 8 months reading 40,000 pages to get to a room in time. Clara wrote that down too. "Who?" she asked. I looked at her. She was young enough that the question was genuine, not rhetorical. She actually wanted the name. She was the kind of person who believed that knowing the name of the person who did the important thing was part of understanding the important thing. She was right. But I did not say the name. Not because it was a secret. Not because I was protecting anyone or performing some form of quiet loyalty. The name was in the treaty record. It was on the drafting citation. Any debrief officer worth the title could find it in 11 seconds. I did not say it because saying it in answer to a casual question in a routine debrief felt like the wrong container for it. Some names deserve the right moment. Some names you hold until the moment earns them. "It is in the preceding record," I said. "Page 4 of the secondary documents." Clara nodded. She wrote a note to look it up. I was certain she would. She moved on to her next question. The debrief lasted another 40 minutes. When it was done, she gathered her notes and stood and looked at the sword one more time before she left. "It is a good reminder to keep," she said. "Yes," I said. She left. I sat in the office after she was gone, and the morning light shifted, and the blue edge of the blade moved with it, tracking the angle of the light across the wall the way a compass tracks north, steady and consistent, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was watching. I pulled up the messaging system. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I opened a new message, address field blank. I wrote 4 words in the body. Read to the end. I looked at those 4 words. I closed the draft without sending it. Not because I did not mean it, because she already knew. She had known before I did that the conjugation section was on page 38,000, that missing it was my specific failure, that reading to the end was the difference between the person who set the pieces in motion and the person who ended up kneeling on a cold stone floor. She did not need me to tell her. Maybe I thought that was the point. The sword stayed on the wall. Every new officer who came through that office stopped and looked at it. Every one of them asked what it was. I told them all the same thing. A reminder of 8 months, of 40,000 pages, of someone who read all of them. None of them asked who. That was fine. I knew. And somewhere past the Thale corridor, in a System 3 postings out, in whatever briefing room or archive or impossible situation she had organized herself into this time, Sable Oren was reading something. Probably to the end. Probably had been for months already. Probably was going to walk through another side door at exactly the right moment and change the architecture of something important, and then request a posting somewhere further out, and leave behind a precedent in the records and a sword on someone's wall and a question nobody thought to ask. I picked up a new mission brief that had landed in my queue that morning. Outer Drevith Boundary System. Complicated transit rights situation. 3 parties, 2 competing claims, 1 procedural ambiguity in a 40-year-old compact. I looked at the note at the bottom of the brief. Recommended envoy, Davin Marsh. Previous Verk proceeding experience. Confirmed male Thavar status. Current Verk witness on record. I set the brief down. I looked at the sword. I said to the empty room, in the voice of a man who has stopped being surprised by the particular way the world works when you are paying attention, there it is. I picked up the brief again. I started reading. From the beginning. All the way to the end.